Chains clattered in the dead of night. The overseer's body swung violently from a towering oak tree, his face pale, his tongue swollen, his boots dangling above the earth he once ruled with a whip. Beneath him stood Joseph Carter, a slave who had endured years of torment, now staring up at the man he had defeated. The plantation lay silent, the wind whispering through the branches. But what led Joseph to this chilling act of revenge would shock the world. Joseph Carter was born into chains. The year was 1812, deep in the humid fields of South Carolina. His first cries echoed in a cabin that smelled of damp straw and smoke. The roof leaked when it rained, the floorboards were nothing but packed earth, and rats scurried in the corners. His mother, Mary, held him tight in her arms, whispering prayers that her son might one day know freedom. But freedom was a dream Joseph never saw. From the moment he opened his eyes, he belonged to another man. William Harlan, the master of the plantation, recorded his birth not in a family Bible, but in a ledger, a cold list of property, side by side with cattle and tools. To Harlan, Joseph was not a child. He was an investment, a future pair of hands for the endless cotton fields. Joseph's father was already gone by the time he was born. Some said he had been sold down to Georgia, others that he had been whipped to death for daring to speak back to an overseer. Joseph never knew the truth. All he had was his mother's voice, telling him stories of strength. At night she would whisper, "Chains can hold your body, but never let them hold your soul." Those words, planted in his young heart, would grow into something dangerous. Life on the plantation left no room for innocence. By the time Joseph could walk, he was sent to gather kindling and fetch water. At 5 years old, he chased after older children, picking scraps of cotton that had fallen in the dirt. The overseers made sure that even the youngest contributed. And then came the first scar. At 8 years old, Joseph stumbled while carrying a wooden bucket of water. It spilled across the dirt path, soaking his trousers. Thomas Greene, the overseer, caught him. Greene was a tall, broad-shouldered man with cruel eyes and a permanent sneer. His whip was always at his side, oiled and ready. Without a word, he lashed Joseph across the back. The boy's scream echoed across the fields, but Greene did not stop until blood streaked the boy's shirt. From that day forward, Joseph carried not just scars on his skin, but fire in his soul. He would never forget the laughter in Greene's eyes as he walked away, leaving the boy crumpled in the dirt. The plantation was a machine of suffering. At dawn, a conch shell blew, pulling the slaves from their cabins. Sleepy children clung to their mothers before being dragged into the fields. The day stretched under the blazing sun, cotton tearing at fingers until they bled, while overseers patrolled with whips, barking orders like wolves circling prey. At night, exhausted bodies returned to cabins with little more than cornmeal or scraps of salted pork. Hunger was constant. Yet in that endless cycle of misery, the slaves carved out moments of humanity. On Sundays, when work was lighter, they gathered by the river. The air filled with hymns and spirituals, songs that carried both sorrow and hope. Joseph's voice, even as a boy, was deep and powerful. He sang with a passion that drew others close. In those moments, surrounded by voices, he felt something stir inside him: unity, strength, and the belief that chains could one day be broken. When Joseph grew into his teenage years, he became one of the strongest in the fields. His shoulders broadened, his arms grew thick from endless labor, and he could outpick most grown men. But strength brought new dangers. Overseer Greene watched him closely. Greene despised defiance, and Joseph carried it in his eyes, a refusal to bow completely, a spark of dignity that could not be crushed. By 16, Joseph saw the world of slavery for what it was: a carefully constructed cage. He saw mothers torn from their children when the master needed money. He saw women dragged into the big house at night and return with haunted eyes. He saw men chained to posts for days in the blazing sun. punished for the smallest act of resistance. One Christmas, when the master and his family feasted inside the grand house, the slaves were given scraps, stale bread, leftover bones, and watered-down ale. The contrast was unbearable. Laughter spilling from the windows of the house, while the people who made that wealth possible shivered outside in the cold. Joseph never forgot it. That Christmas planted another seed inside him, the knowledge that the master's joy was built on his people's suffering. Mary, his mother, remained his anchor. She worked in the fields by day and comforted Joseph at night. She told him stories from Africa, passed down through generations, tales of warriors who resisted conquerors, of kings and queens who refused to bow. Her words painted pictures of a world far beyond the plantation, a world where Joseph could imagine himself not as property, but as a man. But Mary's strength could not shield him from the overseer's cruelty. Greene seemed to take pleasure in breaking Joseph. Every mistake was met with lashes. Every glance that lingered too long was punished. Joseph's back became a map of scars, each one a reminder of humiliation, each one another reason for revenge. And yet, Joseph learned patience. He did not lash out recklessly. He listened when the elders whispered in the cabins about rebellions on other plantations. He memorized the paths through the woods, the creeks that could hide footprints, the shadows cast by the moon at night. He watched Greene's movements, when he ate, when he drank, where he kept his whip. Joseph's anger grew, but so did his cunning. He knew one truth above all: to strike too soon meant death. To wait for the right moment meant freedom, or at least revenge. By the time he reached manhood, Joseph Carter was no longer just another slave in the fields. He was a man carrying every scar, every humiliation, every whispered story of rebellion inside him. His silence was not submission, it was preparation. And as the years passed, one thought returned to him over and over again. Thomas Greene, the overseer who had scarred his back and his soul, would one day pay. The only question was how and when. But what Joseph could not know yet was that his moment of vengeance would not come quietly. It would come in the dead of night, under the branches of an ancient oak tree, in a way that would haunt the plantation forever. By the 1820s, Joseph Carter had grown into a man, broad-shouldered, powerful, and hardened by years of endless labor. His back bore deep scars, his hands were calloused, and his eyes carried the quiet fire of defiance. But while his body had become unbreakable, the chains of the plantation never loosened. And under the cruel watch of Thomas Greene, life became a storm of torment that seemed without end. Greene thrived on suffering. Unlike Master Harlan, who rarely ventured into the fields and preferred to count profits from the comfort of his big house, Greene lived among the slaves daily. He walked with his whip coiled at his side like a serpent ready to strike. He relished in punishment, finding excuses to humiliate and degrade. To Greene, pain was not just control, it was entertainment. One morning, the sun had barely risen when Joseph watched Greene beat an elderly slave named Samuel for moving too slowly. The man's frail body collapsed into the dirt, but Greene's lashes fell harder, each crack echoing across the fields like gunfire. Joseph clenched his fists until his nails dug into his palms. His blood boiled, but he held his tongue. To speak out meant death. To wait meant survival. That day etched itself into Joseph's soul. He could never erase the sight of Samuel's broken body, dragged away by fellow slaves. He could never forget the overseer's smirk, as if cruelty itself was a badge of honor. Greene's cruelty was not confined to the fields. At night, he prowled the quarters, barging into cabins under the excuse of inspection. Women trembled at the sound of his boots, children hid in the shadows. Whispers traveled among the slaves of assaults too terrible to name, of women taken into the darkness and returned with hollow eyes. The fear of Greene spread like a plague, suffocating every corner of the plantation. But Joseph was different. He carried that fire his mother had planted in him, the belief that even in chains, a man could hold on to dignity. And Greene saw it. That fire threatened him. So he made Joseph his target. The punishments grew harsher. If Joseph's row of cotton weighed a pound less than expected, Greene's whip cut into his back. If Joseph straightened his spine after hours of stooping, Greene's boot struck his ribs. One night, Greene dragged Joseph into the center of the quarters, tied his hands to a post, and whipped him in front of everyone. "This is what happens when pride burns too brightly," Greene sneered as Joseph's blood dripped onto the dirt. But even then, Joseph did not scream. His jaw locked, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He endured the lashes in silence. That silence was more powerful than any cry. It was defiance, and Greene hated him for it. The years rolled on, each season bringing harvests of cotton and harvests of pain. Joseph's mother grew weaker, her body bent from decades in the fields. Still, she whispered hope to her son at night. "Your time will come, Joseph. You must endure. You must wait." He clung to her words like a lifeline. Then came a bitter winter, when frost clung to the ground and food grew scarce. On New Year's Eve, while the master's family celebrated with music, wine, and roasted meats, the slaves were given little more than scraps. As Joseph huddled in the cabin with his mother, he could hear the sounds of laughter spilling from the grand house, the fiddles playing, the clinking of glasses. The contrast seared into him once again. A world divided by cruelty, where their suffering was the foundation of another's joy. The breaking point came not in winter, but in spring. One afternoon, a young boy named Daniel, no older than 12, stumbled in the field, dropping his basket of cotton. Greene descended on him instantly. The whip cracked across the boy's back, again and again, until he lay trembling in the dirt. Joseph stepped forward, his body tense, his every instinct screaming to intervene. But another slave gripped his arm, whispering desperately, "Not yet. You'll die." Joseph stood frozen, his chest heaving, his rage burning like fire. He watched Daniel's blood mix with the soil. And in that moment, Joseph swore to himself, this could not continue. Something had to break. But Greene sensed the danger. He saw the rage in Joseph's eyes, the way the man held himself with quiet power. So Greene plotted his own cruelty. He sought to break Joseph not just with pain, but with humiliation. One Sunday, after the slaves returned from their gathering by the river, Greene ordered Joseph forward. Before the entire plantation, he forced Joseph to kneel, pressing the whip handle under his chin. "You think you're a man?" Greene sneered. "You're nothing but a beast in chains. And I'll remind you of that every day." Laughter erupted from Greene's lips, but the crowd of slaves stood silent. Joseph did not answer. He lifted his eyes and stared into Greene's, saying nothing, but promising everything. That stare was a warning, one Greene dismissed, but one that would soon seal his fate. From that day, Joseph's hatred grew sharper, colder. He no longer dreamed merely of escape. He dreamed of revenge. Revenge not just for himself, but for Samuel, for Daniel, for every man and woman who had suffered under Greene's lash. At night, Joseph began to plan. He studied the overseer's habits, when he drank, when he slept, when he wandered the grounds alone. He memorized the strong branches of the great oak tree at the edge of the plantation, where the wind howled through its leaves. An idea began to form, dark and dangerous, but irresistible. Greene believed himself untouchable, but Joseph knew one truth the overseer did not. Every chain has a breaking point. And Joseph was ready to break his. But how he would do it, and the chilling sight the plantation would wake to, was something none of them could yet imagine. The spring of 1833 brought with it more than just the greening of the fields. It brought the breaking of Joseph Carter's patience. For years, he had endured the whip, the hunger, the humiliation. For years, he had buried his rage, waiting, calculating, watching. Now, after the whipping of young Daniel, after the public kneeling meant to strip him of his manhood, Joseph knew the time had come. He could not escape the plantation alone. Greene and his men patrolled the woods, hounds ready to track any runaway. Escape was a gamble with death. But revenge was certain. Revenge could send a message, not just to Greene, but to the entire plantation. It would show that even a man in chains could rise against his tormentor. Joseph's mind worked in silence. While Greene strutted about the fields with his whip, Joseph's eyes measured the oak tree at the plantation's edge. It was ancient, its trunk thick as 3 men, its branches spreading like arms into the sky. To Joseph, it looked less like a tree and more like a gallows waiting to be used. Each time Greene passed by it, Joseph imagined the overseer's body hanging there, boots dangling, life drained from his cruel eyes. But to act, Joseph needed courage beyond his own. In the slave quarters, after the long days, he whispered to a small circle of trusted men. These were men who had also suffered under Greene's lash: Isaac, whose wife had been taken to the big house and never returned; Moses, who still limped from a beating years before; and young Daniel, whose scars were still fresh. Their voices shook as they spoke, not with fear, but with a hunger for justice. Still, the risk was great. Greene carried a pistol. The master had dogs. If they failed, their punishment would be beyond imagination: hanged, whipped to death, or worse, buried alive as warning to the others. But Joseph's words carried weight. His deep voice, steady and commanding, stirred something inside the men. "We've lived as shadows," he told them. "It's time Greene learns we are men. He has spilled our blood. It's time we spill his." The men agreed. The plan was simple in its cruelty. Lure Greene near the oak tree, overpower him, and let him taste the rope he had so often threatened others with. The days that followed were filled with silence, but beneath the surface, the plot thickened. Joseph hid scraps of rope beneath his bedding, twisted from fibers stolen bit by bit from the plantation's supply. He measured its strength in the dead of night, pulling until it cut into his hands. He whispered no word of it to his mother, fearing her heart would break. Instead, he prayed beside her, his lips moving in silence while his mind burned with visions of vengeance. Sunday came, a day when the slaves were given a fraction of rest. That evening, Greene, drunk from whiskey, staggered about the fields. The master was away visiting relatives, leaving Greene in charge, and he relished his temporary power. He barked orders, struck a man for no reason, and mocked the hymns the slaves sang. His voice carried through the night, an ugly sound in the quiet of the plantation. Joseph watched him. Every movement, every drunken sway, was a signal. The time had come. The next night, under a moon shrouded by drifting clouds, Joseph and his men set the trap. They waited near the oak tree, its branches groaning in the wind. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, the cries of night creatures echoing in the distance. Isaac whispered prayers. Moses gripped the rope in his hands, his knuckles white. Daniel, trembling but determined, stood ready. Joseph's heart pounded, but his face remained calm. He had waited years for this. Each lash, each scar, each humiliation led to this moment. He felt the weight of his ancestors behind him, the whispers of his mother's words. Chains can hold your body, but never let them hold your soul. They lured Greene with lies, whispers of a runaway hiding near the tree, rumors of stolen tools. Greene, drunk and suspicious, stormed into the darkness with his whip in hand. "Where is he?" he barked, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Show me the coward." But the coward was not Joseph. The coward was Greene himself, a man who thrived only when others were bound. In the shadows, Joseph stepped forward. His tall frame loomed before the overseer, his eyes burning. Greene sneered, raising his whip. "You again," he hissed. "I'll break you tonight once and for all." But Joseph did not flinch. Behind him, Isaac and Moses moved like hunters. The rope tightened in their hands. Greene lunged, but Joseph caught his arm. For the first time, the overseer's power faltered. Joseph's grip was iron, forged by years of labor, stronger than Greene could have imagined. The whip fell to the dirt. Greene's eyes widened in shock as Joseph's men seized him, forcing him to the ground. The rope slid over his neck like fate itself. Greene thrashed, cursed, spat threats. "You'll all hang for this." "You'll," his words choked into silence as Joseph pulled the rope tighter, his muscles straining, his jaw clenched. The overseer's boots scraped against the dirt, kicking, searching for escape that would not come. The oak tree stood silent witness, its branches creaked as the rope was thrown over and tightened. Slowly, Greene's body was lifted, his curses replaced by strangled gasps. The man who had once ruled the plantation with fear now dangled helplessly, his power broken in the very place he believed himself untouchable. The slaves stood in silence, breathless, watching the overseer's final moments. The wind howled through the branches, carrying away his last cries. For Joseph, it was not triumph he felt, but release, years of pain flowing out of him as Greene's body swung against the night sky. The turning point had come. There was no going back now. But what the plantation would awaken to in the morning, and how Joseph's fate would unfold, would be more shocking than any of them could yet imagine. The overseer's body swung in the dark, creaking against the rope, his boots scraping against nothing but air. For years, Thomas Greene had strutted across the fields, whip in hand, his voice booming like thunder. Now, his voice was silent. His tongue lolled grotesquely from his mouth, his face pale in the moonlight. The oak tree groaned as the rope strained under his weight. Its branches, which had shaded slaves for generations of suffering, now held a different burden, the body of the man who had brought them torment. The men stood frozen, their chests heaving, their hands trembling. Isaac crossed himself, whispering, "Lord, forgive us." Moses, his face streaked with sweat, whispered back, "No, let the Lord judge him." Young Daniel, his small frame shaking, stared wide-eyed at the swaying corpse. This was the man who had whipped him until his blood soaked the dirt, and now he was nothing but a husk hanging from the tree. Joseph stood apart, his eyes locked on Greene's lifeless body. His heart thundered in his chest, not with fear, but with something deeper, a strange mixture of relief and defiance. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times. Greene choking on his own cruelty, dangling helplessly like the men he had beaten, punished by the very rope he had once used as a threat. The silence of the night was heavy. The usual chorus of crickets and night birds seemed to hush, as if the earth itself recognized what had just happened. The only sound was the rope groaning and the faint rustle of leaves above. But silence would not last. The slaves knew it. Morning was coming. The overseer's absence would be noticed. The master would return. The world they knew would shatter under the weight of what they had done. Joseph turned to his companions. His voice, low and steady, carried like a command. "Leave him here. Let them see him. Let them know we are not beasts to be beaten. Let them know we are men." Isaac hesitated. "Joseph, they'll kill us all." "They kill us already," Joseph replied. His words hung heavy in the air. "Better to die standing than live forever on our knees." The men nodded, fear still etched on their faces, but a strange pride flickering in their eyes. For the first time, they had struck back. For the first time, they had broken the chain of silence. The night crept on, thick with tension. The slaves returned quietly to their quarters, but none could sleep. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Men sat in silence staring at the ground. Women whispered prayers into the dark. Every ear strained for the sound of discovery, the alarm, the dogs, the master's wrath. At dawn, it came. A scream shattered the stillness. One of the house servants, sent to fetch water, had stumbled upon the oak tree. Her cry echoed through the plantation, a sound of terror that drew others running. Within moments, a crowd had gathered. Slaves stood at a distance, eyes wide with shock, while white men from the nearby farms rushed in with shouts. There he was, Thomas Greene, dangling from the tree, his body swaying gently in the morning breeze. His skin had turned a ghastly shade, his eyes bulged open in eternal horror. The overseer, the man who had ruled with fear, now hung like a criminal, displayed for all to see. The master's family returned in a frenzy. William Harlan himself, dressed in his fine coat, stormed onto the grounds, his face red with rage. "Who did this?" he roared, his voice shaking the very air. He rushed to the tree, staring up at Greene's lifeless form, then turned on the crowd of slaves gathered nearby. "Which one of you animals did this?" But no voice answered. The slaves stood silent, their faces masks of fear, but their eyes carried something different, a hidden fire, a quiet satisfaction. For once, the balance of power had shifted. Harlan's rage grew. He ordered Greene's body cut down, the rope snapped and tossed aside. As the overseer's corpse hit the ground with a thud, dust rising around him, Harlan shouted to his men, "Find them! Someone will hang for this!" Dogs were brought out, their barks echoing across the fields. Riders scoured the plantation, searching cabins, dragging men into the yard for questioning. Whips cracked as overseers demanded names. But no one spoke. Not Isaac, not Moses, not Daniel, not any of the men or women who knew the truth. The slaves kept their silence, bound together by Joseph's unspoken command. Still, suspicion brewed. Eyes turned toward Joseph. He had always carried himself differently, always met cruelty with a steady gaze instead of bowed submission. Harlan had noticed. Greene had noticed. And now, everyone noticed. That night, Joseph was seized, dragged into the yard, chained to a post, his shirt torn from his back. The whip lashed against his skin, the same whip Greene had once carried. Blood spilled, his flesh torn, but Joseph did not cry out. His silence enraged the master even more. "Confess," Harlan bellowed. "Confess, or I'll kill you where you stand." Joseph lifted his head, his eyes burning even through the haze of pain. And for the first time, he spoke words that would echo through the plantation. "You already kill us every day." But tonight, Greene paid his due. The yard fell silent. Gasps rose from the slaves who watched, hidden behind the shadows of their cabins. Harlan's face twisted with fury. He raised the whip again, but something in Joseph's voice, something in his defiance, made even the master hesitate. The punishment continued, but Joseph's spirit did not break. And though he was battered and bleeding, word spread like wildfire through the quarters. Joseph Carter had stood before the master and spoken truth. That night, the plantation buzzed with whispers. Children repeated the story in hushed tones. Women clung to it like a prayer. Men carried it like a spark in their chests. The overseer was dead. The master had been defied. And it was Joseph Carter who had done it. The oak tree became a symbol. Slaves passing by would glance at it with secret pride, their eyes lingering on the branch where Greene had once swung. Some even whispered that the tree itself had taken vengeance, that the spirit of the earth had joined Joseph in striking down the cruel overseer. But Joseph knew the truth. It was not spirits, not chance. It was men who had chosen to act. Men who had decided that enough was enough. Yet he also knew one thing more. The cost of rebellion was never cheap. Punishment would come, perhaps death, but even in death, the overseer's hanging would remain a mark that could not be erased. For Joseph Carter, the moment of vengeance had already passed. What came next would decide whether he lived long enough to see freedom or whether his name would be remembered only in whispers. But what the master planned, what the law demanded, and how Joseph's story would finally end, was a fate more haunting than anyone could have imagined. The oak tree stood silent again, its branches swaying in the September breeze. The body of Thomas Greene was gone, buried in a shallow grave near the fields he once ruled. But his death did not vanish with him. It lingered, thick in the air, like smoke after a fire. For days, the plantation buzzed with tension. Riders came and went, neighbors whispering in horror about the murder. To the masters, it was not simply the death of one overseer, it was an act of rebellion, a crack in the iron wall of control. And cracks, once formed, have a way of spreading. William Harlan paced his grand house like a man possessed. His pride was wounded more than his body ever could be. That his overseer had been hanged, by slaves, no less, was an insult that clawed at his very soul. To him, it was not just Greene's death. It was the audacity, the defiance, the refusal to remain broken. The slaves waited in dread. Every dawn could bring chains, executions, or the dreaded auction block. Mothers prayed over their children. Men sharpened hidden blades, whispering that perhaps the time had come for more than whispers. The air felt heavy with the weight of something larger than all of them. Joseph Carter sat in the darkness of his cabin, his back scarred and raw from the master's lash. Each movement was agony, but his spirit burned with the fire of what he had done. Greene's face haunted his dreams, not with guilt, but with grim satisfaction. For every cry that overseer had dragged from the throats of innocent men, for every scar etched into their flesh, justice had finally come. But Joseph knew it would not end with Greene. On the third night after the hanging, the master's men came for him. Lanterns flickered against the walls of the quarters, dogs snarling, chains clinking. Joseph did not resist. His brothers in silence, Isaac, Moses, Daniel, watched from the shadows, their fists clenched, but they knew any fight would mean slaughter for them all. Dragged into the yard once more, Joseph was bound to the same post where Greene had once whipped him. The irony was bitter. Master Harlan stood before him, his voice trembling with rage. "You think yourself a man?" he hissed. "You think yourself free? I'll show you what becomes of a slave who raises his hand against his master's law." A pyre was built. Wood stacked high, dry straw laid thick. The smell of pitch filled the night air. The slaves gathered, forced to watch, their eyes wide with terror. Some wept. Others looked away. But Joseph stared into the flames, unblinking. As they lit the fire, the crackle of burning wood echoed across the fields. Smoke curled upward, choking the night sky. The heat licked at Joseph's skin, but he did not cry out. His voice, hoarse but strong, rose above the roar of the flames. "You can burn my body, but you cannot burn the truth." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The master shouted for silence, but Joseph's words had already struck like thunder. "I was born in chains," he cried, "but I will not die in them. Greene is gone, and so will you, one day. Our time will come." The fire surged. Sparks shot into the black sky. The slaves wailed, torn between terror and awe. The overseers shouted for the crowd to be silent, but they could not silence the pounding of hearts, the fire now spreading in men's chests as much as on the pyre. Joseph's final scream was not one of pain, but of defiance, a sound that would echo in the memory of every man, woman, and child who stood there that night. When at last the fire consumed him, when the ropes burned away and his body crumpled into the flames, the master thought he had destroyed the rebellion. But instead, he had planted a seed. For weeks afterward, the plantation remained cloaked in fear. Whippings grew harsher, chains heavier, overseers stricter. Yet no amount of cruelty could erase the memory of Joseph Carter's voice rising above the flames. Children whispered his words in secret. Mothers told the story to lullabies at night. Men carried it in silence as they swung their hoes and cut the cane. And slowly, Joseph's defiance spread beyond one plantation. Word traveled along the whispering chains that linked the enslaved, from one field to the next, from plantation to town, carried on tongues at the markets, sung low in the sorrowful hymns of the church. They burned him, the whispers said, but he did not beg. They whipped him, they said, but he did not break. They hanged their overseer, they said, and showed them we are men. Years later, when the war came, when shackles shattered and freedom was declared, the name of Joseph Carter lingered like a shadow across the land. Some said he was a hero. Others said he was a madman. But among those who had lived under the lash, his story was more than memory, it was a promise. The oak tree still stood, its branch scarred from the rope that once bore Greene's weight. Slaves who passed it would glance upward, their eyes filled with both sorrow and pride. For that tree was more than wood. It was a witness. It had seen cruelty. It had seen justice. And it had seen the moment when chains, if only for a single night, were broken. Joseph Carter's grave was never marked. His ashes scattered into the soil, mixed with the blood and sweat of generations. But his spirit lived on in every whispered hymn, every quiet glance, every hidden act of resistance. And perhaps, on nights when the wind howled through the fields, those who listened closely could hear it still, a voice carried in the rustling leaves, defiant, unbroken. You can burn my body, but you cannot burn the truth.